Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today has mastered, I would think, 3 languages other than the English we are currently speaking. He knows Elizabethan BFA, he knows music, and he also knows how to talk to junior high school kids. Bob Crabb, welcome to Fair Folk at Work.
Thank you.
But before we get to all those intriguing teasers, I must ask the first question that we ask everybody here at Fair Folk at Work, which is, who was the person who said to you, there's this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
Well, see, I don't recall a person saying anything to me because where I was living at that particular point, there was no one in my immediate vicinity who was actually involved in fair. I read about it, I believe, probably in the Chronicle, and decided in 1983 to go see what it was all about. And so I went to Nevada on what I believe was the next to the last weekend of fair in 1983 and ended up spending both Saturday and Sunday there, even though I hadn't expected to be there more than a few hours because everything around it was just so intriguing.
How old were you at the time?
30, let's see, that would be 37.
How would you describe yourself climbing into the car before you actually entered the fair?
Interesting question. I was just kind of a California geek that was kind of out of a fish out of water where I was living. I was still living in what I would call my ancestral home, the Central Valley, but I never felt really at home there. At least I hadn't felt at home there for several years before that. I was very close to actually moving out of Central Valley into the Bay Area, where I feel much more at home. So I was sort of a fish out of water in a very liberal part of the San Joaquin Valley.
Do you remember any of the first impressions you had that first weekend at fair?
I remember the music and I remember probably the poetry more than anything else. I got very taken up by the poet that was there and reading his stuff and trading poetry back and forth because I myself have written a fair amount of poetry in my life, none of which has ever been published, but that's all right. I don't care.
So you wandered onto the fair and you found a fellow poet and you said to yourself, and this is where you fill in the blank.
I just really liked what he'd written. And so I, liked reading what he had. And I also, the same thing with musicians that were around, because I myself was a recorder player. I myself have been singing pretty much all my life. And so I found a lot of that extremely appealing. Plus, I'd been in madrigal groups for years and years before I ever went to fair. So I kind of knew the era musically.
Prior to fair, what was your favorite genre of music to both listen to and play?
That's a question that actually can't be answered. My genres of music are kind of like and have been so eclectic that they don't really go to any definition. Although I did spend a lot of time when I was younger singing and performing folk-ish music, both American and also some ethnic music from particularly Northern Europe, Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia. So I had a big background in that. I had studied ethnomusicology in San Francisco State before I ever went to the fair, and I was in a Chinese orchestra for 2 years. I learned a lot about Indian music. My favorite music was always whatever I was listening to then.
Do you come from a musical family?
No, not really. My father was forced to play the violin for a couple of years when he was younger, and According to him, he hated it. But when I was about three and a half, my sister started taking piano lessons. And I was fascinated by the piano. And I would sit down at the piano after she was done and play the stuff that she had played, sometimes better than she could play it, even though she was 2 years older than I was. So I started playing the piano. I started singing. I bugged my mother to actually lie and get me into piano lessons and a choir at the church we were at the age of 4.5, even though they weren't supposedly taking anyone who was younger than 5.
I know asking questions about a 5-year-old Bob Crabb sort of. Well, anyway, if you can answer, do you remember the first time that music sort of came alive to you?
The only recollection I have back in my early years of playing music, when I first became really aware of how much music meant to me, was probably, even though I'd been doing it for more than half my life at that particular point, was probably in 6th grade, when my then band teacher decided that I was a lousy trumpet player. Here, try the French horn. And I remember distinctly picking up the French horn and absolutely falling in love with the sound and the playing of it. And all of a sudden, I had an instrument to play that I really, really wanted to practice. And it made a huge difference.
Tell me about your introduction to Renaissance music. How did that happen? How did you feel about Renaissance music?
I guess I was introduced to Renaissance music as a genre, primarily vocal music, through choirs I sang in right when I was in 9th grade. I had a wonderful choir teacher, an absolutely fantastic choir teacher. I never would have done 90% of what I've done in music if it weren't for what Mr. Wing did for me. And as a freshman in high school, even though our choir was only 24 or 25 kids, there were several of us that were very precocious musically. And so he formed a small select madrigal group out of about 8 of us. And so we started doing motets and catches and madrigals in 9th grade. That's where I was really introduced to it. And then also my orchestra director did some Renaissance rearrangements in high school. So I got it both instrumentally and vocally.
Do you remember some of those madrigals? What were they and what in them appealed to you?
Okay, well, I mean, one that I know I've known like for so long that I don't remember when I learned it was Now Is the Month of Maying, which I'm pretty sure almost any madrigal singer has sung at one point or another in their life. I love the way in the Renaissance, more than later on, they have a lot of polyphony where, one voice is doing one thing and one voice may enter, a bar or two later and do the same thing, but a fifth higher, or the same thing, but an octave lower, or something like that, and how they melded together and how it would come to an ending. It was always very satisfying. And it amazed me, as someone who had already started writing music at that particular point, how the polyphony worked, even though the two parts would start separately, well, like a Bach fugue, they would come together harmonically and still create this wonderful harmonic rhythm that went along underneath it, which basically most people would describe as the chord structure that goes under it. But this was achieved more by having two basically melodic lines complementing each other at the same time.
For a totally random question, do you like puzzles?
Some kinds.
Do you regard composing in this style a form of puzzle solving?
Oh, in a way it is, yeah. If you're writing a melody that you want to use polyphonically, you have to look at how the chord structure works and then overlay them so that the chord structures will be similar from one entrance to the next. So they're complementary. But you can't create the sound of that era if you have a basic, a measure based on, say, a dominant chord above another measure based on a tonic chord. They will clash in a way that wasn't typical at that particular time. And there is that puzzle aspect to it. I like best are usually mathematical or word puzzles.
Getting back to first years at fair, how was the process of going there one weekend just because you were looking for something to do, get transformed into a place to hang out?
Well, in 1983, I did the first fair that I did, which was actually the Dickens Fair at the Fox Theater. And I made a lot of friends through being at the Fox who were also in Renaissance Fair. So they informed me as to when workshops started. So what I did is I just went ahead in 1984 and showed up at the beginning of workshops. I went there with the intention of either playing recorder or singing with somebody, but found out real early on from a couple of people that St. Cecilia's, which was basically the guild of musicians, was almost a closed shop. In other words, they're sitting there going, oh, well, we've got enough musicians. We don't know what you can do, but we don't want you yet. So I was taking just workshops for fun. And one of the first workshops I took was a basic country dance workshop. Well, I'd been dancing since I was 8. I started doing ballroom dancing and other dancing when I was very young. Being musical, having really good rhythm, and being a dancer, it was very interesting to me. And in the second dance that we learned in that workshop, Patty Blanco came up to me and said basically something like, do you have something to do at fair? And I said, no. She says, well, do you want to be a merry prankster? And so that's what happened the very first, on that very first day. I believe I met both Morgan and Patty, and I basically became a court dancer because they didn't have as many men as they did women who knew how to dance.
Can you give me the names of, if you remember, the people at Dickens Fair who said, by the way, there's this thing called the other fair?
Anton Sepernich, who was Mr. Fezziwig at that particular point. And I ran into the singers of a group called Merriweather, which was Linda Underhill, Robert Young, and a couple other people like that. They kind of got to know me, but in a very strange way. But I don't remember specifically who said, oh, by the way, in August, Renaissance Fair workshops start. You should go.
What do you remember Patty saying? What was her philosophy of the Merry Pranksters, and what did she want her dancers to do?
Remember a philosophy per se. I mean, the whole idea was to have fun doing what you were doing and make sure the audience realized you were having fun doing what you were doing, because it made it more fun for the audience. So, play it to the audience, play it big, enjoy yourself, put as much of you into the dance as you can.
Do you remember the sensation of being on stage when you first went on stage and performed as a Merry Prankster?
No, not really.
Um,
I always enjoyed it, but I don't remember. No.
do you remember any particular dances or dance sets that gave you joy in just going out there and doing it?
I remember the day we actually accomplished Fain I Would If I Could, which was always considered a really difficult dance. And we actually managed to do it and did it on stage several times that year. I don't remember what year that was, but I always liked doing things like Stingo and Greenwood and dances like that. I do remember one dance set where we were dancing at the center of the world, both pranksters and I want to say Brunos, but that's not what they were called at that particular point. We're dancing together in this mass group, and we had this one set where instead of doing a hey once, we did a hey twice in eight beats, which was a little bit insane in the rocks. But we were young, we were foolish, we loved to dance, and it worked.
take me forward in time and you're dancing with merry pranksters. What came next?
Merry Pranksters had some problems along the way, and they almost ended up not being at fair. And Patty and a couple other people pulled out, and I found myself all of a sudden being the senior member of Pranksters that was there. And so I actually led the group for a couple of years, but I was pretty much involved with either Pranksters or Cuthberts. When we moved from Black Point, the Nut Tree, all of a sudden somebody was going around fairs asking if anybody knew anything about playing brass instruments because they desperately needed another trumpeter to play in tourney band. So I said, yeah, I've got a little experience. So all of a sudden I found myself not only dancing with pranksters and parading with Cuthberts, but playing in tourney band. And then in another couple of years, tourney band actually became us. My family was tourney band. My son and I both playing trumpet, and my wife on a timpani set that I had found. So we became the tourney band, and we were tourney band at Casa de Fruta for 7, 8 years until they decided they didn't want a tourney band anymore.
One of the themes of this podcast is that fair gave many people sort of their first experience in managing something. I mean, they just sort of went around and said, does anybody know blah, blah, blah? And often were put in sort of charge of blah, blah, blah. Is that true for you?
It's happened more than once. I mean, I became basically the head of Merry Pranksters for a while. I inherited tourney band. We had a group that used to sing madrigals around fair. It was never formally on stage, but we'd go sing in court and go sing for other people. And I was in charge of that because I knew more about the music than the other people did. So, yeah, I also ended up playing in Queen's band because I play sackbut, which most people don't even know what a sackbut is. But then hopefully the people hearing this podcast will know what a sackbut is.
Well, I think my sister listens to these, so I don't know if she knows what a sackbut is. So if you can describe it for my sister, that would be great.
Well, a sackbut is easy. It's the Renaissance forerunner to the trombone. So it looks a lot like a trombone, but the bell is slightly different and it's got a smaller bore on it. So it's a milder sound. The sound doesn't carry as far and it's not as loud usually, but that's what a sackbut is.
In your work outside of the fair, have you ever said to yourself, I've herded dancers from stage to stage, so taking charge of this project should not be hard for me to do?
Well, I guess in a very big way. I mean, I spent almost 30 years of my adult life teaching drama and music, mostly on the middle school level. And believe me, there's not much difference between a bunch of performers and a bunch of middle school students. It's all still what we affectionately call herding cats.
What drama lessons you observed or did at fair are translatable to a junior high school crowd?
I probably learned improv better than I ever had before, even though I had taken drama classes before I ever went to fair. But being at fair, I learned how to really improv and improv well. I don't consider myself a good actor when it comes to a scripted part. I have trouble, frankly, memorizing the words, but I can play a character for hours on end without any problem at all. I attribute a lot of that to fair, and I taught this to my kids at school because times in the middle of a show or something, I think, well, things will go wrong and they need to figure out how to get themselves out of these situations or continue the story, keep it going, et cetera, et cetera. And that I attribute a lot to fair. I think it gave me the confidence when my principal put out this feeler. I'd been at the school I was at for about one semester or the beginning of my second year. And the person who was doing drama really didn't want to do it anymore. And he put out a questionnaire that basically said, do any of you have any drama experience? And I said, yes. And then he said, well, would you like to take over the play productions and the drama department? And I said, sure, no problem. And I don't think I would have felt that confident about doing that if I hadn't been doing fair for several years before that.
What was your fair persona?
I just decided that Rupert Taylor was a tailor because I knew how to sew at that particular point. I had made my own costumes, and it just seemed that being a tailor made sense. And since Merry Pranksters was a middle class dancing group, not a peasant group, we needed all to have characters that made our position in fair seem middle class.
Let me ask you a counterfactual. If you lived in a world that did not have a Renaissance fair, how do you think your life would have played out?
Well, I don't believe I would have been nearly as happy with the last 40 years. I was the black sheep of my family. I was basically, I probably would have continued teaching school because I found out in my early 20s how much I really enjoyed teaching school. So I probably would have just ended up being a teacher someplace and not branched out pretty much beyond that because I'm pretty much bashful and don't like putting myself out.
To get back to the connection between fair and teaching junior high kids, do you recall any specific meet and greet or sort of fair things that translate to junior high school theater students?
No, not really. That's an odd that's a hard one. I didn't do a lot of meet and greet. I remember taking the workshop from Will Wood that basically said, okay, you're new to fair here. You could, learn one line, use it over and over again. And I learned one line and I don't remember what it was anymore. And I used it over and over again until I felt more confident to use more lines. I know that because of some of the background I had there, I can now go through Dickens, which is where I am more often now than I am at Ren Fair. And very often I will see someone confused or looking at the map or something like that. And I have no problem going up to them, trying to help them find out where they're going. A lot of what I did at fair translates to the idea that at school, my classroom was the classroom that was open an hour before school opened in the morning and was open during all of the recesses and lunches. And we had kids that would hang out in there all the time. And I know they would often come to me for advice, but I don't know if that's Ren Fair or just my background or what.
I think it's safe to say that at fair, boundaries between being a performer and relating to somebody backstage could be fairly fluid.
Oh, yeah. I started making friends at fair quite a bit right off the bat because all of a sudden I was around a bunch of people that I felt comfortable with, and I didn't usually feel comfortable around most of the people I met outside of fair. It was a totally different persona. I always felt relatively judged by people around me, and they would look at things like the fact that I don't read well and stuff like this. And it was a problem, but at fair, it was never a problem. Growing up with learning disability is a little hard, but
Sure.
it didn't seem to make a difference at fair.
Can you remember some of those people who made the transition to fair easier?
Pranksters was a great place to be. I remember the musicians we worked with. I remember Avis. I remember Morgan. I remember dealing with drummers and whatnot. Fast friend that I made at Pranksters very early on was Doug Walter. Doug and I both were in what we called the Suicide Dance Squad because we danced all of the Merry Prankster sets. And we also danced all the Scottish sets. So we were often running from stage to stage between things. And I'm still a close friend with Doug, but there's been lots of people on the way through. Sabrina Cuddy, I've known since my first couple of days at fairs.
I've sort of asked you this, and if you, as a dancer, were to construct your favorite set of dances that just made you happy to dance and to hear the music and just generally perform in front of somebody, how would that set go?
See, if I were to put together a dance set, I like to start with Dargison, which is a really fun dance to enter on. Put in something like If All the World Were Paper, which is fun because it has a song that goes with it. And I've always liked singing the song. Putting in something like Greenwood or Faint I Would If I Could. It's a nice, showy, but difficult and fun dance to do in there. I've always really liked Stingo, which is a really good, lively dance. And maybe ending the set with something like Magi Cree. I've gotten to the point now that when I hear any of these tunes, my feet want to do what goes on, but my legs no longer want me to do what goes on.
Another sort of theme of this podcast is that, unlike a lot of other organizations one could work for, the fair was largely bottom up in that it basically gave you the parameters to work with, but then left a lot of the details up to the people who are actually doing it. First of all, do you find that true about fair?
Well, we were given an idea of who we were in the overall scheme of the village that we represented, the area that we lived in, the people that we knew. And within that, particularly when you weren't on stage in your own particular group, as you're wandering through fair, you get to interact however you think you might have interacted historically at that particular point. We were always encouraged to try and keep it period looking or period sounding, however you want to possibly decide that. But yeah, a lot of the ideas of fair were allowed the people the freedom to be whomever their persona was that they picked out.
And did you like doing that?
Oh yeah, I mean that's all basically improvisational theater, which was really fun for me and always has been. I'm fine in front of an audience until I have to be Bob Crabb. So long as I am Rupert Taylor or Dr. Strong, I'm fine. Bob Crabb doesn't like being in front of an audience.
So, like, fair in your fair persona is,
It's a safety. It's a place where you can be what you dream you are, but you don't have to be you.
and I'm sorry, who is Dr. Strong?
Dr. Strong is my character at Dickens Fair, and Dr. Strong has been my character at Dickens Fair since 1984.
Can you give me a thumbnail description of Dr. Strong?
Dr. Strong is the headmaster of a school that David Copperfield goes to, and he's writing a dictionary. He's a lexicographer and an educator. Being a person who is fascinated by words and has taught school basically most of their adult life, it just felt like a great fit. So I play him as sort of an absent-minded professor.
I'd like to give you another sort of improv kind of thing. You are you, and you are with the rest of the family having Thanksgiving dinner. Let's say you have a niece, we'll call her Zoe. She's 14, and she suddenly pipes up with, I want to do the Renaissance Fair next spring. Just look at Uncle Bob and how he turned out. I want to be just like Uncle Bob. Your sister puts down her mashed potatoes and looks at you and says, "Yes, Bob, why should I let my daughter, the light of my life, go to the Renaissance Fair this spring?" You put down your mashed potatoes and say,
Well, I think branching out into Renaissance Fair, if that's what she's interested in doing, is a great place to learn and grow. I raised two boys at Renaissance Fair. I think it's a wonderful place for children. I think it's a great learning experience. I'm all for it. I think there are certain places that she would better fit in than others. And, if you want me to, I'll help you figure out where a good place to start would be for
what
starting
would you
there.
recommend as the place for Zoe to start?
As a kid of 14, starting in Cuthbert's is always a really good idea. There's generally a bunch of very protective type people around when you want them, but it depends on what she would be interested in. I mean, if she wants to be a dancer or something like that, there are dance troupes out there. She could get involved in music. But let's assume that she wants to just start doing fair and experiencing it. I would say starting in a place like Cuthbert's is a really great place to start.
So what did your kids do out at the fair?
My older son started in Cuthbert's and he was in parades for about 7 or 8 years until he dropped out and did other things, and he hasn't gone back since then. My younger son started out basically as a stage prop because he started in fair. The first time he was at fair, he was 5 days old. But by the time
I'm sorry, what show was he in?
He wasn't really in a show. He got passed around during pranksters occasionally. It's called Pass the Baby Around. And he used to actually sit on my shoulders while I was dancing. It worked really well because basically an entire face would grin. Of course, every once in a while he'd fall asleep on my shoulders, and then someone would have to take him off my shoulders and they'd pass him around again. But when he was about 3.5 or 4, he became a crier. So far as I know, the youngest crier that Renaissance Fair has had. And he remained a crier for several years. He also worked tourney band with me, like I said, because he played brass instruments, so he played trumpet. And lately, the last couple of years, he's been involved with a couple of booths. As a matter of fact, he and a friend of his that he's known since this friend was born, who's about a year younger than he is, and they're both fair brats. They put together a gaming booth of sorts, sort of based on live action role playing, based on that at fair.
Actually, I'm intrigued. Can you fill in a few details on how you do that type of role playing as a booth at fair?
I'm not 100% sure how they set it up, but I know that it was almost kind of like a scavenger hunt. The only thing I did for them is they got a bunch of discs. They were about the size of a quarter, and I painted orange and purple and green, and people would buy in and then they would go from place to place. And part of it, they were selling a discounted, almost like an old Disneyland ticket book where you would get to go and play the axe throw and various other things, but for less money because you bought it through them. There was also some kind of like scavenger hunt effect with this, but the people who were buying into this were supposed to assume a persona of their own as they did.
I think that's brilliant.
And it worked really well, according to him.
Which actually sort of leads me to another theme of this podcast, in that by setting up a basic framework, Phyllis Patterson et al. Also set up a mechanism by which the fair could grow organically. Because it's a bottom up, try it and see what happens kind of atmosphere. Someone like your son and his friend could say, let's do a scavenger hunt kind of period at the Renaissance Fair. They're just going to have an idea and go with it. Let's see. I think we left you in your career path at fair. You were doing the Merry Pranksters. You were helping administer their Merry Pranksters. Did you ever have much contact with Phyllis?
Oh, yeah.
What was what we're doing here out of the Renaissance Fair message that she gave you?
Well, most of the contact I had with Phyllis was directly involved with Dickens Fair and not so much with Renaissance Fair. So I don't remember actually interacting with Phyllis at Ren Fair much at all. However, I was involved with Phyllis, and I actually went to her home several times with things that had to do with Dickens Fair. And
Oh, okay. Let me change the, I guess, noun of that sentence and say, did Phyllis convey to you was the purpose of environmental theater in general and creating an immersive theater environment?
well, the idea I always got from Phyllis was that she wanted to have some sort of living representation of our sort of theatricalized concept of what being in the Renaissance at a harvest festival would be like. So we were always kind of asked to keep it in the idea that this was a harvest festival we were out there to enjoy ourselves. It was something that didn't happen very often, but we needed to keep our actions and our interactions correct to the period as we best perceived it.
So I'm getting the impression that you have observed court a lot.
I've observed court somewhat, yeah. I often went into court to sing, and I
Mhm.
did get to dance with the Queen quite frequently as a prankster because she would come to one of our sets on a daily basis, and I was the one who partnered her for probably 5 or 6 years in a row,
Was that Louisa?
and that was Louisa.
What was your impression of Louisa as the queen and where did it come from?
I've ever dealt with was the one who reminded me so much of how they described Elizabeth. I mean, Louisa was small in stature, but could fill 3 or 4 rooms at a time. She reminded me in many ways of my mother being 4'11. But my mother, when she entered her room, you knew damn well that lady was there. She took presence. And Louisa may have been small in stature, but there was nothing small about Louisa. I dearly love the lady. And I still occasionally get a chance to run into her or communicate with her. So it's really cool. She always had that feeling you wanted to honor her. It wasn't the idea that this is an obligation. It was more like, wow, I'm in front of the Queen.
Were there other nobles or court situations that made you feel the same way?
There were several people in the nobles who I became fairly close with. Rory Downward, Joan Juranchet. We would sing in court, basically country songs, and we would sing in court anywhere from a trio to an octet, probably once a weekend for most of the last 10 years at Black Point. But since several of us were involved in other groups, most of the time we had to pick and choose when we actually, so maybe once a day was all we ever got to do. But yeah, there were several people in court that
Did you have any similar relationships with any of the stage or street people?
three people, yeah, most of the stage groups, not so much, because most of the stage groups had a tendency to keep among themselves. Although I have lots of friends who did dogs and doublets and the stuff that they did. But there was a big overlap between dogs and doublets and Cuthberts, and there was a big overlap between me and Cuthberts because my wife was always part of Cuthberts. Several of the people in dogs and doublets sang in Coventry Carolers for a while back when it was first formed.
When talking to people about pranksters, they mentioned that some of their shows almost verged into like musicals. I mean, they had song, dialogue, setup. There was a more verbal theatrical element to pranksters. Can you talk about that? First of all, is that true? And second of all, how was that manifested in their shows?
Well, we had a couple of shows, particularly featuring mostly Southern pranksters, because there was a group of pranksters who were from Southern Fair that always came up to do Northern Fair. And then there was a group of us who were Northern California people who basically just did Northern Fair. So there were always a couple of shows during the day that were loosely based around a story. Most of the leading actors in the story were from the Southern Prankster group, but it would lead from one dance to another for one reason or another. And it was propelled by the dialogue or the really silly story that propelled it forward. And we incorporated some singing in there. Robert Hill and myself often sang together on stage. He was primarily a fiddle player. I was primarily a dancer, but we're both tenors. We had the distinction of singing duets on Inyard stage that could be heard at Turkey Legs. And if you remember the setup of Northern Fair, that's quite a feat.
Do you remember what some of the origins to some of those silly stories were? Were they like fractured fairy tales or?
They were fractured fairy tales, fractured tales of gods and stuff, because you've got to realize in the Renaissance, there was quite a resurgence of old Greek and Roman god myths. They became popular again. And so at least a couple of them were around that. I remember one in particular that had to do with what a woman really wants. The conclusion at the end of it was that a woman really wants to have her own way. I don't remember the story itself, but I would, if it got started, it's one of these things that's still in the back of my mind. I'm sure I would know half the lines. It's like doing St. George and the Dragon. I know all of the lines for St. George and the Dragon, even though I wasn't in it very often. I sure saw it a lot.
If you were to associate a sense sensation with the fair, what would that be?
The only two things that come to mind as sensations of fair is I was the person who was often up, one of the earliest people in the morning. I've always been a morning person. So I was often down in fair, wandering from place to place at as early as 6 o'clock in the morning. And there was very seldom anyone else on the street than me. But there was always a little bit of incense that you could smell, and there was always a faint smell of marijuana in the background. Now, the incense, I don't mind. The marijuana, I'm allergic to, so I would know to avoid it if I started smelling it.
Actually, I think the word I was trying to pronounce was sense, Sense. So
Oh,
it could be any scent, any sight, any sound, just sort of you hear it now and you feel, oh, that's from the fair.
okay. The sense that really brings me back to fair is silence, because my favorite time of the day at fair was 6 o'clock in the morning. And I go up into the Coast Range now. I go off of Highway 9 far enough to where I don't hear the traffic anymore. And it takes me right back to fair. And all I hear out there is an occasional quail or a bird call or something like that. And I realize, you think of fair as being this place that's just bustling with people and alive and all of that, but the silence of the early morning, the time I really loved being up at fair, is the part that brings me back to fair more than anything else.
When you were kind enough to say yes to doing this interview, I hope that the next sentence in your brain was, I got to be sure to mention so and so. So this is your time to remember who or what was so and so.
I guess the two people I haven't really mentioned in fair is I haven't really said anything about Mariana, who was a woman I met in 1983 when I first got involved in Dickens Fair. And although I don't know where she is anymore, and I haven't seen her in years now, she gave me a sense of being at that particular point, because she was the person who was closest to me in the first fair I did. And she introduced me to a couple of other things outside of fair, which were fair-like in many ways. The other one who's really important to me that has a direct bearing and direct part of fair as it goes is I need to mention my wife, because if it weren't for fair, I never would have met the lady. And to me, that's damned important.
Okay, I'm going to ask this similar question in a different way. As we've gone along and been talking, have you been reminded of somebody that you haven't thought of for a while or wasn't planning on talking about?
Well, I mean, okay, I guess I should mention Lynn Elder, who got me started playing trumpet at fair. So all of a sudden, people at Renaissance Fair realized, oh, you actually know something about music. Because I spent all the years at fair until we moved to Vacaville with people going, oh, you're a dancer. And even though I had studied music all my life at that particular point, very few people knew that I knew anything about music until I took, certain workshops. I always owe a real thanks to Linda Underhill, who gave me what I call my test of periodicity. We sometimes do things at fair musically that aren't truly period, but she gave me this advice back when I took a workshop from her so long ago that I don't remember what year this was. Basically speaking, if the song has a tune to it that sounds like it could have been written in the period, if the words don't refer to anything that's more modern than what might have been around in the period, then we can assume it's a period song, even though it may not be. It doesn't actually have to be a period song to make it work. It just has to sound as if it could have been a period song, because, someone could have dreamt it up 300 years ago. Who knows?
I find that a refreshing piece of advice that can be used in a lot of situations, including the Renaissance Fair.
Right. Well, we use it all the time in Dickens Fair. I mean, there's a few songs that we do. I'll be quite honest. I have a book that I use at Dickens Fair for caroling that has in it at least 6 pieces that I have arranged. And so, but we use them because I didn't write anything that sounds glaringly modern.
How many Elizabethan slash Victorian songs have you written?
Over my lifetime, more than 20.
And do you apply the Linda Underhill principle to each of them?
Yeah, basically that and what I know of Bach.
And
Uh,
Bach is period.
Bach is not period to the Renaissance, no, but Bach is period to the
To the modern ear,
well,
it's
Bach is period to anything in Victorian times. And the principles that Bach used were actually around before Bach used them. He just kind of defined them in such a way that now people who want to write things like that study his chorales because they're such a great use of how voice leadings work. So, the things that just come out of your head are still period sounding, unless all of a sudden you sing like Poulenc, and because Poulenc would not sound period.
okay. Here's final question, situation, role play, whatever you want to call it. Congratulations. You have just been awarded the highly coveted Phyllis Patterson Award for Lifetime Achievement in Fair Skills Applied to Life. The band has been told to sit on its hands, and you have as much time as you like. Give me your acceptance speech.
Okay, Dan, this is where all of a sudden Bob Crabb comes out in this. And what Bob Crabb would do at that particular point is find a way to get off stage as quickly as he possibly could and go hide. So my acceptance speech would be, oh my God, you mean it? Thanks. And that's the extent of it.
Well, then I'm not going to insist upon it, but simply say thank you very much. I've enjoyed the heck out of this. I got a lot out of it. And I think I will push the stop recording button. I think that's here. Stop recording. That's my January 2024 interview with Bob Crabb. Questions or comments for Bob? I can forward them to him if you email them to me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can also be directed to me at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if somebody you or know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, you may contact me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.